Joining us on Friday. I know that this is technically considered a weekend. However, I think that it speaks volume that you're present and that obviously this topic is one worth further exploration. My name is Dr. Shanae Gill. I'm a research fellow at Thomas Jefferson University, and I participate as part of the Professional Development Committee with CSJ. I also am over the Reentry and Restorative Justice Committee for IOC. And I have the pleasure today of introducing four phenomenal individuals who are leading, at least from my perspective and what I have read, on the forefront about critical race theory. They're going to be educating you today about why critical race theory is critical and exploring what are the role and implications of counselors. We have with us Dr. Richard Garvin Jr., Dr. Fawn Gordon, Dr. Megan Seaman, and of course, the distinguished Ms. Brooks Collins-Gaines, and they're going to be introducing themselves today. And again, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you all, and I am hopeful that this presentation is not only beneficial to you, but also in your endeavors as you move forward in service. Welcome, you four. Ms. Gaines, take the floor, please.
Thank you, Shanae. That was super sweet of you to introduce us that way, and to be called esteemed, wow, I appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and share with you a little bit about myself. Well, just briefly, we can introduce ourselves. So again, my name is Brooks Collins-Gaines. I am a counselor, I'm also teaching and an instructor at the University of Akron, and I'm also a doctoral candidate at the University of Akron as well. So today, as mentioned, we're going to be sharing a little bit about, we're going to be talking about why is critical race theory critical? Where do counseling professionals go from here? So these are going to be our objectives. Essentially, we want to really talk about, define and describe the relevance of CRT, what CRT is and how is it relevant to our practice in counseling or in mental health in general even. We're going to talk about 6 different competencies and learn how to apply them and relate them to CRT. And also we're going to talk about and have some ongoing discussion and some reflection on 3 of the, we want you guys to leave here being able to identify 3 competencies and be able to infuse those in your practice. So as the pages that follow confirm, race may not be a reality, but racial thinking is, and as such warrants closer examination. I just thought that was a really good quote, a nice quote, kind of insinuating that we need to continue to explore and examine race and racism in today's age. So what is CRT? So CRT is one of those things that it's going to be a little bit harder to really to define, but it is a movement. It's a collection of activists and scholars that really sought out to try to study and transform the relationship among race, racism, and power. It builds upon critical legal studies and radical feminism from the 1970s. And originally, the concept was developed with a focus on legal studies and the law by wanting to examine the policies of law and the power and privilege embedded, as well as like racist institutions that we have. It's part of, when we think about critical race theory, it is part of the current civil rights movement. One of the things that makes CRT different from previous civil rights movements is that it questions the foundation, the very foundation of the systems in this society, in this country. So it's asking the questions of why are the systems the way that they are, marginalizing folks, embedding racism into the very fabric of our nation. So some of the names that you typically hear, some important names in critical race theory are Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, Richard Delgado. Those are a couple of names. There's many more, but I really want to kind of go over and sort of set the stage for the tenets of CRT, like what CRT is, what are those major pieces. And as I'm kind of talking about these, I really want you all to sort of think about your work, what you do, whether you're an educator, whether you're a counselor, social worker, whatever it is that you're doing in your work. Think about how these tenets might apply to the work that you do. So first of all, The first one is racism as ordinary. So with this one, we know that racism is not something that's rare. Like it is implicitly and explicitly sort of embedded in the different layers across society. It is essentially ingrained in the fabric, and I like to say in the DNA also of our nation, in its systems of institution and power. So it is not one of those things that that just kind of like came. It is built into the fabric of our nation. And because of that, a lot of people who don't experience racism on a regular basis or daily basis, they may not notice this these racist policies and whatnot. So it's important as mental health professionals for us to really kind of look into that. So the next one is material determinism or interest convergence. So this one is really kind of looking at racism, how it benefits people in power, specifically, actually, AKA white people. It can change, like, so racism can and will change, but only if the change in racism serves or benefits white people. Now, does racism align with, like, is it aligning with the changing economic conditions? Is there self-interest for the white elites? Another question is, like, what do we think about, like, with lower income white people, and how does racism serve them in the hierarchy of race, right? So even when we think about lower income white individuals, race still serves them when it comes to power and privilege and white supremacy. Social constructionism is the concept that many of us have heard. We've said before, racism or race is socially constructed, is not biological or cultural like ethnicity would be. So racism, it is built on a system of hierarchy, as I mentioned earlier too, of norms. So it's really looking at, like, this idea of good versus bad, better, worse, and even like this concept and idea of winners versus losers. So in this society, we know who historically have been the winners, and then everybody else tends to fall in that loser category on the hierarchy. The next one, the unique voice of color. This one to me is, like, so necessary. So when we think about the unique voices of color, it also is sort of the idea of storytelling. So this is like when we want to really include the voice of people of color and honoring and hearing their perceptions and the perceptions of, like, real people who are experiencing real things in order to be able to make progress towards social justice and racial equity. If we're not hearing the voices and the stories and the realities of people of color, then it's going to be that much harder to be able to really change systems, because who else cares as much as the people who are living it in that perspective. Also, the ways that we need to hear these voices, we really want to think about places like research, right? So who's doing the research? What is the research about? So we want to hear those stories in research. We want to hear those stories in our those voices in our education systems, in our history, in business and finances, and then even in politics and law. And when I think about that one, I just have to say, yay, Ketanji Brown Jackson. I'm so excited. This is like a huge time in history. So I had to just give her a quick shout out, because I think that is a voice that we are experiencing and we are going to have on the Supreme Court justice or on the Supreme Court as it relates to even, like, law. And then also differential racialization. So this one particularly specifically focuses on the ways in which, like, the dominant society, again, AKA white people, racialize different groups at different times in history or even currently. So, but it's only with marginalized groups. So we're not racializing white people. So it also depends on the needs of those in power. So we're going to be racializing these individuals at times or whenever we need to, because it serves us well. So for instance, in history, there have been times where Mexicans or Japanese individuals were needed for agriculture, whereas, that might have been a time where Blacks or African Americans were not needed for certain things. So they may have been a little bit less racialized differently. And even the idea from a different perspective, I was thinking about like with COVID and 9/11. So let's think about how Asian Americans or Asian individuals have been severely racialized and discriminated against differently during this time with COVID-19. And then even like 9/11, we experienced and we saw Middle Eastern individuals, Muslims, largely racialized as well. Then the last one is like intersectionality or non-essentialism. Intersectionality, that concept has become like really major in our field. We're looking at it, we're seeing it, we're exploring it. Intersectionality is essentially like the intersection of multiple identities, such as like a white Jewish woman or who's bisexual, or a Hispanic immigrant who happens to also be Black. So these are multiple racial or different identities, often looking at marginalized identities where, gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, ability status, all of those different things. And also when it comes to non-essentialism, like really kind of looking at like the physical traits of an individual doesn't necessarily determine deeper underlying like commonalities among a particular group. So just because you have a Black person who may be Christian, it doesn't mean that this individual has the same experiences as another Black Christian person. So not all Black Hispanics, for instance, can speak for the other. So why is CRT important to our profession? Now, the statement that I'm about to make is probably going to be something that's going to be uncomfortable for a lot of people. The reality is that they're like racism, bias, discrimination, all of those things are very prevalent in our practice, in our field. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that just like these other systems that we talked about, policing systems, the law, medical field, and mental health is just as prevalent. And this is not a comfortable notion to accept or to even want to believe, and it's true. So in our education, we have to look at like our education to our students and our treatment of our clients. We want to be mindful of broaching this topic. I think it's really important for us to talk about race and racism, the experiences of our clients, the experiences even in recognizing that our students have real lived experiences of racism. So with students, it's ingrained in how we might offer support to them, how and what we include in their education and our discussions in classes or whatnot. What do we provide in coursework? This is not just about multicultural competency. This is really understanding that racism is a major factor that individuals, and it is embedded in our system. So understanding and exploring like with clients, or with students, I'll say, even when it comes to like the idea of theories, when it comes to them taking courses in treatment planning, when it comes to taking courses in assessment and all of the courses that we're teaching for our students, but taking it even that next step further, needing to understand this and knowing how to work with our clients in those areas and understand that our treatment planning, our assessments, our interventions, our theoretical framework, all of those things matter. Now, so if you're a professor, if you're a counselor educator, whatever it is that you're doing, I think it's important to realize that racism does impact our clients and our students on a daily, like we have students that racism impacts daily on a regular basis, whether it's with them personally or they're experiencing it something largely in this world. So how does that impact their worldview? How does that impact their education or their understanding and their practices? So I'm going to give you guys a couple of just sort of intersecting identities. And I want you guys to just ponder, think about how you might work with them differently than you might work with a person who might be white with some similar issues. For instance, like an African-American gay male client presenting with depression due to discrimination. Now, if you had a white gay client presenting with depression, that his issues might look a little bit different, or the way that you might work with him might look a little different. An Asian American female client that's shunned by her family. A Latinx female who's looked over by her employer for a promotion, even though she's well qualified. Or an African-American female client that happens to be married to a white male and they have biracial children. Like really think about how those things and how CRT and some of those tenets of CRT might be useful in understanding when working with these individuals.
All right, good evening. My name is Richard Garvin. I'm a counselor educator. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, and I teach at Tennessee State University in the counseling department. And here on the screen, you can actually, I really just wanted to spend like a really quick second to talk about this. And I know that a lot of institutions, especially in the higher education arena, we have like these offices of diversity and inclusion or diversity affairs. And I want to be sure and be clear that CRT is not diversity and inclusion training. It's really more so of this interrogation, investigation of the role that race and racism is playing in society. And as Brooks already mentioned, it kind of started in the legal academy, and then it started to spread to other areas of scholarship. So at this point, I have about 5 discussion questions, and I want people to feel completely free without judgment to really share your opinions and views and thoughts. You can either do that verbally if you'd like to, or you can use the chat. I'll actually put the question in the chat, and I'll also read it as well, because I know that some people are probably multitasking and driving and at soccer games and just doing a lot of different things on this Friday evening. So I'm gonna try and meet as many of those as I can. So our first question is in the chat, and I'll read it out loud as well. So the question is, what social identity has impacted you, and how does that look when race is intersected with it? And Brooks already talked about social identities, but just to kind of go back over that again, that could essentially be anything from socioeconomic status, that could be sexual orientation, that could be gender. So when you think about those social identities, how has that impacted you? And then when you add that extra layer there as far as race, like what would that look like? What does that look like? And possibly while people are, okay, there we go. Absolutely. Absolutely, Brett, I could see that. I'll share just a short story. Sometimes I take my kids out. I have 2 kids, one that's 8 and the other is 4, boy and girl. And sometimes I take them out just to kind of give my wife a break. And sometimes when I'm out, people will kind of just stop me and say things like, you know, oh, so Black people do take care of their kids, or you're a great father. And I don't know, that could be layered, that could be microaggressions. That's a very layered kind of statement, right? But then when I kind of think about that in the intersection of like race, as well as this role of being a father and what that looks like in society, right? So when you start to think about how those things, because then it could be thought of like, would you say that to a white man that's like out taking care of his kids? I don't know. It's just a thought, but I'm just trying to get the conversation started. Absolutely. So in the chat, we have people talking about socioeconomic status. We're also talking about the role of working at a conservative Christian school. Absolutely. Karen, okay. Absolutely. I'm saying as an Asian American and female, some people have assumptions but I'm docile. I have also had some people fetishize me. Socioeconomic status, particularly going from one socioeconomic status in childhood to another in adulthood. As a Black woman, there is an assumption about my status, and many of the microaggressions I experience are conflection of race, gender, and class. And from Tara, the social identity that has impacted me is being a white woman who must assume I am a certain social status, right? But then their minds change and attitudes when they see my children are biracial, which is sad and it's kind of leaving me. It causes me to feel isolated. I should know I am in a racially divided area. Absolutely, absolutely. So when we start to look at the intersection of some of our social identities, as well as how race can impact those things, I think it's really important that we explore those. So then that kind of really just makes me want to think about our second question, which, because I think this kind of ties right into what I'm seeing in the chat here. And so our second question is, how does educating about critical race theory, how do you think that benefits or empowers students of color? I mean, if you rely on one news source, this idea of critical race theory is like the worst thing ever and it should be removed and all these bad kind of stigmas attached to it. But let's look at the flip side of that. Perhaps, how do you think that empowers students of color as opposed to removing it? What about, do you think it empowers? Do you think that it benefits students of color? Absolutely, giving them a voice. Find their voice. Validation of experiences. This is great. Rebecca, I like that. I've talked with clients about this when they feel they don't fit in a university. It's really validating for them. Absolutely. And, I just want to highlight two resources that I want to kind of just say. So if some people are kind of on the fence about CRT or would like more information about CRT, Brooks mentioned Richard Delgado. Richard Delgado has written a book on the 3rd edition and it's titled Critical Race Theory. So I just want to put that as a resource out there. And then also a second resource I'd like to share with you is there's a doctor, he teaches at Harvard in public health. His name is Dr. David Williams. And he's done a lot of research looking at health disparities and the intersection of race. He's done a lot of research looking at how people of color, when it comes to the healthcare field, are treated different and have different health outcomes, even as it relates to the mental health profession. Opens up for space for deeper conversation, trust systems. Absolutely, I'm seeing this theme of empowerment, embraces, greater sense of Black joy. Jennifer says, helps to open the dialogue and reduce the shame of many white people so they can better hear the various viewpoints and impacts of marginalized identities and the impact of intersecting identities. Dr. David Williams, absolutely. Then the last one I'll read is, it takes a critical look at social structures so it supports students with understanding the broader context and gives language to what occurs. Absolutely, I agree with that 100%. Oftentimes, as we're all aware in the field of counseling, there sometimes I think that we can kind of see in our clients the sense of relief when we provide them the language to maybe some of the challenges that they've been going through and they couldn't identify maybe what was happening. And then we provide that language to them. And now there's this sense of relief. And that relates to mood-related disorders, personality disorders. But with respect to the conversation today, I think CRT also fits with that as well. So we'll transition to our third question. There we go. So the third question is, what ways can you embrace your role in mitigating, disrupting, and dismantling systemic oppression? I'll say that again if you're driving. What ways can you embrace your role in mitigating, disrupting, and dismantling systemic oppression?
This is such a great question, Dr. Garvin, because it really does force us to kind of like stop and think about what can I do specifically in my real life, in my professional life, in my personal life, to start to make a change, because we can't change a system unless every person is a part of changing, doing something.
I agree 100%, 100%. I'm kind of getting lost in the chat, but I'll just share a story here. I at my previous institution, I sat on, I guess, this committee when it would come to, I don't know, when students would have like plagiarism issues, or if there were behavioral issues and the institution was considering suspending them. So I would sit on the committee, and I was one of the only people of color on the committee. And so we had a Black female that came in, and the group was very critical, and she had a lot of traumatic stuff that she was kind of working through, and she had some other issues as well. But just having that voice, once she left the room, just being able to hear how everyone was interpreting the situation, I was able to have a different voice. And I was able to advocate for the student to stay at the school because they were really considering suspending the young lady. So I think just being able to use our voice is so critical in different rooms, whether the room looks like us or it doesn't. Brave and unapologetic, pushing for collective change. I like that. No matter how small a voice is, a voice. And collectively, as we share a vision, our vision has power in advocacy and volume. Beautifully, beautifully said. Vote, speak up. Not having fear of the possible consequences. Absolutely. Dr. Murphy, I would say being unapologetic. Not having fear of the consequences, standing up, calling out, speaking truth. Increase access for mental health. Absolutely. Oh, I love that. Empowering other people of color, listening to people of color, continuing to educate yourself, advocate for people of color in leadership positions, using data to highlight how systems are oppressive. Woohoo. Y'all are on fire tonight. I thought it was gonna be slow on a Friday night. Okay, all right. All right, so I'm gonna shake things up just a little. All right, so I have question 4. And question 4. So one of the previous questions was essentially, how does it empower people of color? And now we're gonna transition to question 4. How does educating about critical race theory benefit white students and educators, white students and white educators? How does educating about critical race theory benefit white students and educators? Ooh, I love it, Brittany. It spurs us to embrace those roles we talked about in question 3, helps us to walk the walk instead of just the talk. Ooh, that's a tweetable. I don't know how many characters you get in Twitter, but that's tweetable. Challenges white fragility, I'm sorry, fragility, and encourages further exploration of inherent privilege in the system. Provides context to people's experiences.
So I'm really curious too, Dr. Garvin, about like people's comfort. So we have people here who are clearly interested in CRT, right? But I'm also curious about individuals' comfort with actually doing some of these things, actually talking to and broaching this conversation with students or clients. Just curious. I want to make sure that people are actually going to be able to take some of the things that they want to be able to do and actually start implementing them and actually doing them.
I think that's a really good point. And we may not have time for question 5. So I just want to leave this because I think, Brooks, that's a really good idea. And what I would like to just say is, I was talking to a friend of mine and we were talking about mice infestation, like field mice. Just stick with me, I know it sounds crazy. All right, so mice infestation. And so what he said is when it comes to treating mice infestation, they put like these packs of poison out in crawl spaces and just different areas. And I was like, well, do they have a scent or a smell to them? And he said, no, mice are curious. And when there's something new in the environment, they will take that and they will take it back to the rest of where the mice are. And then now all the mice are essentially eating this poison and it like dries them out from the inside and then it kind of kills them all off. And so with respect to what Brooks is talking about, what I don't want is tonight's session to essentially be this idea of poison and it just dies off. If you can, I would like for people to kind of maybe take pictures of the chat, or if you'd like to, I can provide all the questions for you. And I want you to take them back to your colleagues, take them back to your peers, take them back to, your institutions that you work for, and allow that conversation to continue and be curious. Be curious about what role you and your peers can do to really further this idea of CRT.
Good
Sounds
evening, everyone. I'm Fawn. Thank you, Dr. Garvin and Brooks, for setting the stage. I think you did an excellent job conceptualizing the race and critical theory. So I appreciate you both for also touching on intersectionality. So a lot of this is going to be a little bit of reiteration, but essentially when we're thinking about CRT as it applies to intersectionality, we are not just looking at, again, the way that those varying identities experience the interplay between power and privilege, but we're also looking at the way that race then has an impact on those other various identities a person might hold. So again, if we're thinking about critical race theory, it's extending beyond this idea of essentially like putting the blame on the individual to, of course, like individuals have work to do, right? But just, getting rid of all of the people who are discriminatory in society isn't going to do enough, because as Brooks has mentioned, the discrimination regarding race is embedded into the DNA. So there is a lot of dismantling that needs to be done. And Dr. Garvin, I think that your questions really got everyone thinking about what are the steps that we can begin taking. But I would encourage you all to not only continue to process, your own identities, but in those that you work with. And specifically, how does race then make or bring another layer of complexity? So even extending beyond this idea of, intersectionality, we can talk about, another idea about this multicultural complexity, right? So not just looking at the identities in the current moment, but what are the social, political, historical contexts of those identities? And how can we, I'm a counselor educator and also counselor. And so how can we, in these different positions, start to help people to dialogue about this? And it really takes this dialogue and uplifting people of color's voices to start to dismantle the foundation of what America has sadly become. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how this impacts mental health specifically. So if you want to go to the next slide, Brooks. So as Brooks had said earlier, it might make some people uncomfortable, but counseling field is no better than any other field in terms of discriminatory practices. So if we look at CRT and mental health, again, there's a lot of different ways that race comes into the conversation. So specifically, if we look at discrimination, absolutely, we understand things like aggressive policing can lead to poor mental health, including, heightened post-traumatic stress symptomology. But outside of, the discrimination leading to poor mental health outcomes, there's also practices that are under the umbrella of our services that are discriminatory in nature. So when we look at these racial disparities, one of the, all of these underutilization of services, for instance, one reason why a lot of people of color don't want to utilize services is because of things like provider bias. We also see poor prognosis, and is one factor as if you think back to your very first counseling class, one of the most important things is building that relationship. Well, how can you build a relationship with an individual who's continuing to live in a society that has constantly and continuously been oppressed, and you might be not recognizing that, or giving voice to that story or trying to understand their story. So we also get into some of the way that the discrimination, on the provider side comes into the actual diagnosis. So you see, Black males, for instance, getting diagnosed at higher rates with schizophrenia. So regarding, our, duties, part of the counseling identity is that social justice advocacy. And we really need to be conscientious about the ways that, even our system, Brooks, thank you. You brought in a lot of great examples of how, even, when we think about the research that has been done in America and the way that it not only oppressed people of color, but it stripped them of their human rights. And then we get into things like, psychological instruments and the populations that are that they're normed on, hardly ever, people with multiple marginalized identities. You know, it's not something that is and still is being done. And I think that this is, again, another example of where we need to like have this elevation, right? When we're utilizing different things like measures or theories, you know, theories in itself, you can see across, you know, many of the counseling courses, all white males creating these theories, and what quote unquote normative development is white males, or a lot of, you know, research again done on, you know, individuals where it's not allowing those voices to be heard. So I would just, again, encourage you all to start to think about all of the different layers, because again, it is very complex, and it really comes down to, you know, we have to move even beyond challenging individuals' thinking. We have to also challenge the system. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Seaman so she can start to highlight some of the ways that we can develop some competencies in order to do this.
Thank you, Fawn, and thank you, Brooks and Richard, for you know, setting up the stage of what we have to deal with, and how we now get to move forward. And I'm Dr. Megan Seaman, and I am a professor at Ursuline College. And I, you know, when we think about competencies, we've, as counselors, you know, therapists, and as counselor educators, we follow standards of practice, we follow ethics, and we follow our multicultural competencies. We all learn about those. Constantine and his colleagues talk about, or her colleagues talk about what those multicultural competencies are, like how we define that. And they define it as the counselor's possession of the appropriate levels of self-awareness, knowledge, and then the skills that we do to pass on that knowledge. So when we're talking about just you know, on a broader umbrella, what this self-awareness is about, it's about interrogating our own attitudes, our beliefs, our values, what we think regarding race, ethnicity, culture, certainly other things like membership in certain cultural groups, or our own cultural privilege and our own discrimination and oppressions that we put on people. So that's that aspect. When we talk about, or when you know, they're asking us to consider the knowledge that we have, that's really engaging in information about our clients or the people we're working with, and their worldviews and their histories of oppression and their histories of you know, of being marginalized and subjugated. You know, critical race theory brings in this kind of interrogation of legal issues, but it also brings in a lot of radical feminism in interrogating patriarchy and power and control and oppression too. So we want to understand these lived experiences of the people that we're working with. And that may be a current kind of a thing, or a intergenerational kind of a thing too. And then finally, the idea is that we then take this self-awareness, take this knowledge, and then we pass it on in an applied way through the skills that we use. And what we're looking to is not draw on these Eurocentric theories and best practices that we have learned along the way, but to interrogate that even, and go to cultural understandings and cultural knowledge that is developed from indigenous groups, from culture-specific groups that help aid us. So that's the umbrella kind of statement at what we're looking at. So when we're looking specifically at critical race theory and the competencies that we would like to develop as counselor educators, as counselors in training, as counselors out there, therapists out there in the world and the practice, these are the 6 that we have come up with. And the first one is knowledge of systemic oppressions, which kind of draws on that whole knowledge area. Self-reflection on race, ethnicity, oppression, power, privilege. Awareness of impact of our own power and privilege and replication of those injustices. Interrogation of the representativeness of current mental health practices. Learning and passing on indigenous models of health and healing. And then collaboration democratically to provide culturally relevant practices. So I'd like to take each one of these one at a time and say, okay, well, now we know this, but how do we actually apply it? So we'll take the competency one. One way that we can investigate this is by just going back to our ACA code, our ACA, the counseling organization, and specifically the multicultural competencies that have been developed there. And Aaron Dondando and colleagues talk about these three specific sections of competency. And one is counselor awareness of own cultural values. 2 is cultural awareness of clients' worldview. And then 3 is culturally appropriate intervention. So it's kind of, again, playing off of those umbrella practices. But looking a little bit deeper, and I don't know if any of you know about have read about cultural humility, and been teaching that out there, but there's a kind of a difference between cultural humility and cultural competence. Cultural competence seems to be the steps that kind of get us there, but cultural humility really kind of gets at those, how we are sensitive to multiple ways of knowing, so that it becomes less a step-by-step process and more of a holistic way of understanding the people that we engage with in life. Cultural humility has 4 basic principles that we can pass on in our education, as educators, in learning as students, and as working with our clients. And the first one is knowing that this kind of critical self-examination is a lifelong process. There's not I've gotten to the destiny and now I am enlightened. That we are always evolving, and we're always building off the knowledge that our generations gave us. And so we need to look at lots of different ways and voices to be able to understand that and build off of that. The second principle of cultural humility is redressing the power imbalances in our client-provider dynamic. So what might, kind of trying to neutralize that field, trying to bring it down. We know our clients come in and they feel dependent on their positionality and the intersectionality of their identities. They may come in feeling like we are the expert and they are the one that needs to be told what to do. And that is something we do not want to lie in. I think about our counseling, ACA principles of counseling, which are, one is based in that we are empowering our clients to help themselves. And we are not the experts on them. They are the experts on them. So that plays into that. The third principle of cultural humility is developing mutually beneficial partnerships with communities on behalf of individuals and defined populations. So these are not meant to be us, or as counselor educators or as counselors going into communities and telling people what to do, or exerting our own power and privilege, but rather listening, going in and helping people, or helping ourselves to understand what the issues are, what are things that are going on. And then the fourth principle is maintaining institutional accountability. And one of the things I think about on a real level as counselor educators is going into our departments and interrogating how we deal with, like Richard had mentioned before, student issues, things that are coming up, and the intersectionality of those issues that happen for students. Looking at really taking a stand on student focused and being student centered in our education and how we mentor our students. From a counseling standpoint, I think that means that going into the places we work, our community centers, our private practices, and interrogating some of the policies and how we bring people in and the resources we provide. So that is a little bit about competency one, trying to foster this knowledge of systemic racism on a real level. The second competency here, all about reflecting, doing a kind of reflection on what's out there, what is the system. There's a number of books that I have mentioned here. Post-traumatic slave syndrome is one of the publications that we teach in our social and cultural issues course at Ursuline College. And it is, if anybody has read it or if you haven't read it, it's a book about how the past, our past histories, is still influencing the present for our Black and African American clients and our students and our colleagues, and how slavery has been causing certainly a mindful and psychological impact, but even on a physical and spiritual level, there seems to be this pervasive and repeated kind of oppression that seems to be maintained. So it really starts to question that. My Grandmother's Hands is another book that is also interrogating what we think is just a cognitive kind of thing, but it's really getting at the somatic and embedded nature of oppression and how that is passed on. And so that offers actually some neuroscience and somatic ways to deal with this cultural oppressions. And finally, a book that we take our students on service trips. We built some sisterhoods with a number of people around the world. And one group we work with out in South Dakota is the Lakota people on the Cheyenne River Reservation. And this book, The Earth Shall Weep by James Wilson, is a fantastic story that brings in voices of Indigenous people here on our land. It brings in oral tradition that also is coupled with traditional ways of understanding history. So these are, again, ways that we start reflecting on the status quo that we've learned. And we can move forward. All right. So the third is this understanding that our own personal self-reflection on the impact of our prejudice and the perpetuation of injustices. A former colleague, a current colleague, but a former supervisor of mine, Clay Rowell, who is a professor at Georgia, University of North Georgia, he created this basically assessment, a self-assessment called the Scripted Prejudice Awareness Narrative Strategy, spans personal autobiography. And what he did was to offer a way for supervisees, either counselors who were looking to get independent licensure or counselors in training, to start critically examining their own way of coming to know, their own way of knowing, especially from that kind of feminist point of view. So there's 3 different sections of this. One that asks about early recollections. The second is social influences, and the third are cultural and current self-understandings. And some questions are, for instance, very similar to what those questions that Richard had offered earlier, like describe the influential people in your childhood and include as many details as possible. A second question might be, how did your ethnic, religious, cultural, familial, financial, all of the different ways we can be, how did that influence your childhood? And then a third question is, describe early memories where you felt different or ridiculed or discriminated against or alone. And so we're starting to get these early ideas asking people how to relate to that. So that's a way to start this conversation about how has this impacted me and how am I perpetuating these things. Service learning programs, Constantine and colleagues talk about how this is so beneficial to foster our educators, our students, our counselors to go out of their comfort zones and go and see and immerse themselves in experiences. Like I said, we bring our students to these sister groups around the world. One is a couple groups in Nepal, we we've been there going on 4 times. We built a sisterhood there, and we work with them, and we learn, and we engage, and we are seen, and we are seeing, and it is a life-changing experience in how we start to look and see other ways of knowing and being and understanding life. All right, so we'll move forward to competency 5 and 6, and we're moving forward even more. So other things, one of the things that Brooks and Richard had talked about earlier is interrogating some of the ways we've come to know. And especially as counselors, you're all trained in a program, or you might be being trained right now. So it's integrating different theories, different understandings. One of the things that I bring into my counseling theories course for my students is Myers' optimal conceptual theory, which really starts interrogating these Eurocentric ways that we've come to know. Generally speaking, our Eurocentric theories are based on individualism, are based on materialism, and based on trying to control nature, control the environment, control people. Where Myers says that more indigenous, or she's speaking really specifically to Afrocentric values and Afrocentric principles, are more based in her research and her understanding in how to be one with nature, how to be more collectivistic, and how to be more spiritual. And so it's really starting to think about what we are teaching our students, and how, and these theoretical ways of understanding psychopathology and illness, and why people have presenting concerns. And finally, I'd like to say that collaboration seems to be key, that we're not just looking within our own field, but we're looking outside our field. We're looking to examine what's happening in school settings, what's happening in a greater ecological setting, you know, our macro systems, and collaborating with those groups to interrogate a whole system that goes from micro to macro. And we can move on to the next. So here, where do we go from here? These are the 4 ways we've come to understand what we can do as counselor educators, as counseling students, and as counselors. And the first is to educate, is to pass on the knowledge that you're learning today, to get curious about where you want to go and learn more from what we've presented today, to be able to interrogate these Eurocentric and white supremacist ways of thinking that have infiltrated the things that we take for granted, the status quo. The second then is to challenge what we think is status quo, be able to come to think critically about privilege and about power and about oppression and control. That is also in interrogating our own ways of knowing, and our own limitations, and where we start to feel those edgy qualities where we don't want to, we maybe feel defensive. And then finally, being able to dive in and connect with other authors, with other researchers, with other readings and books, to be able to advocate for new ways of thinking, for more inclusive practices, and certainly equitable policies. Thank you, everyone.
All right, to wrap us up, I want you all to consider the competencies that Dr. Seaman had provided. And you can consider your own counseling identity. I'm really excited to see how much everybody has been engaged in the chat, or you can also look at some of the prompts provided, but think about the ways that you can start to apply these competencies. And I really appreciate the thoughtful discussion. I feel like an hour is like 10 minutes, and we all need to like have a workshop weekend or week. Thank you all.
Thank you all again for the phenomenal presentation. I think to say esteemed is an understatement. That applies to your entire team. Everyone, before you log out, please ensure that if you are wanting to receive continued education credits, that you complete the link that was included in the chat. And given that you all have registered, any additional content that their team has provided will be sent out via email. So we welcome you, hopefully, to our next presentation, and I hope you four also return for further dialogue about this topic.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Again, the link for CEUs is in the chat box.
Again, we thank you so much for attending our event. And at this time, we will begin removing folks from the room. Again, have a great time.